Good morning, Facebook. It is that time again. It is time for my 2 cents Tuesdays. And I hope this is a blessing to you as it has been to me. Today, my 2 cents is regarding the miracle of God performed through the prophet Elisha, which is discussed in 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 1 through 7. And for those of you all who do not know, miracles are those supernatural acts that are performed by the will of God to interrupt what typically our daily function is. So what typically goes on in life, God will use a miracle, a supernatural act to interrupt that, and it is used to bring forth some type of revelatory truth. So in this particular miracle, the prophet Elisha encounters the widow woman, or the Shunammite woman, who is left with her two sons. Her husband has died, and essentially she has nothing. And when Elisha encounters her, she tells him, "All I've got is a small jar of oil." And Elisha looks at her and says, "What do you want me to do? What do you have?" And when she tells him that that's all she has, he tells her, "Go and borrow some empty vessels, some empty pots from your neighbors. And don't just get a few of them, get a lot of them. Get some empty vessels and bring them back. And you and your two sons shut yourself in and pour the oil into the vessels until they are full, and set the full vessels aside. And from that point on, you will be able to sell those vessels, and she and her sons would then live." Well, let's break that down a bit, and I want to share with you what God has given to me, and that is the supernatural acts, and the real supernaturalness of God, if you will. So there are four things. I want you to look at the supernatural prospects of improvement that are shown in the story, the supernatural power of God that's shown in the story, the supernatural provision of God, and then finally the supernatural promise of God. Back then, widows, they had a certain stigma attached to them. When their husband died, essentially their social and economic status drastically changed, and usually for the worse. If there was land, if there was an inheritance, that was left generally to the male children, if there were male children, and it was up to the widow to help to maintain this land until those male children obtained the age of majority. Oftentimes, however, that was impossible because the widow was unable to maintain that land. And so you've got that backdrop of the stigma and the negative connotation that is associated with a widow woman back in those times. But let's look at verse 3, and let's look at the prospects of improvement. Elisha tells the widow woman, "Go and get these vessels." If you can imagine the embarrassment that a widow woman would have going to all of her neighbors and asking for these empty vessels. There may have been questions. Why do you need empty vessels? Why are you asking to borrow these vessels? Just the mere act of the widow woman having to go and ask her neighbors. Now, keep in mind, Elisha didn't say, "Go and ask your neighbor for food. Go and ask your neighbor for water." He specifically told her, "Go and ask your neighbors to borrow these empty vessels and to get a lot of them." And so it's important to see the supernatural prospect of improvement. Just by her being obedient to the word of the prophet, there is some prospect for improvement in her situation. Let's look at verse 4 to see the supernatural power of God. In verse 4, it talks about the widow woman, after getting the empty vessels, going back into her home with her two sons, shutting the door and shutting herself in. Sometimes we have to be closed off from everything that's around us, and let's just have a shut-in with God, if you will. Close ourselves off from the cares of this world, close ourselves off from what's really troubling us, what's troubling our mind, what's troubling our spirit, and have a shut-in with God. And that's exactly what the widow woman did. And it is in that shutting in that God displays his power. As the widow woman began to pour oil into these empty vessels, and it's thought that this small jar of oil was just enough oil that was used in anointing. We're not talking about gallons of cooking oil or things of that nature. We're talking about a small jar of oil. But she has all of these empty vessels, and she's pouring this oil into these empty vessels. And her sons keep bringing her the vessels until they're full, and then they're set aside. And so you see this supernatural power of God by God allowing this oil to continue to flow until these vessels are full. And so sometimes we don't know where the provision is coming from, but God will continue to allow that oil to flow until our vessels are full. Now, keep in mind, the sons kept bringing the vessels until they were full. The widow woman then asked for more vessels, and the sons say, well, we're all out. All the vessels they're all full. And that's when the oil stops to run. And that in and of itself is supernatural, because there obviously had to be a supernatural flow of oil that didn't come from the widow woman, didn't come from the sons, didn't come from the prophet Elisha. There was a supernatural flow that continued until these vessels were full and set aside. And it's important to note here too, and this was something that really spoke to me. She poured out until she was empty. She poured out until there were no more vessels. There was no more emptiness except for her. And that was the prime opportunity for God to then begin to pour into her. After being obedient to the word of the prophet, she was able to then receive the supernatural provision that God had for her, which is found in verse 7. She is then told to take the vessels of oil and sell them to pay her debt. Now, her sons were going to be sent into slavery to pay the debts that she had because her husband had died. The men of those days, the husbands of those days, were the breadwinner. And so when her husband died, she was left with all of these debts. And that was a part of her plight, was debtors were coming after her left and right, and her sons were going to be taken into slavery to satisfy these debts. However, in verse 7, God shows us that he had made provision for the widow woman to be able to pay her creditors and not have her sons sent into slavery or indentured servitude, if you will. And then also in verse 7, you see a supernatural promise. And that supernatural promise is this. It says, you take the rest, widow woman, and you and your sons shall live. Now, I don't know whether or not the widow woman's husband had land that was left to her male children. I don't know whether or not they had land and was unable to maintain the land, or whether there was no land left at all. But what we do see is the supernatural promise that God says, you and your sons shall take the rest and live. So either they were going to be able to maintain the inheritance that was left by her husband, or they were going to have enough to maintain themselves without any inheritance, without any land. God was going to make a way for them to live and not be in slavery and bondage to anyone else, to not be exploited or taken advantage of by neighbors or anyone else in her life at that time. So today, think about the miracle that you are looking for from God. Think about what you need God to do in your life. Think about the supernatural provision, the supernatural promise, the supernatural prospects of improvement that God is showing you, that's interrupting your daily life, that's interrupting the way you traditionally think that God is going to provide for you, or the typical way that you think God is speaking to you in your life. And I encourage you to sit down and enjoy God. Shut yourself in and receive the promises, receive the prospects, and receive the provision that God has for you. Be blessed, Facebook. And until next time, enjoy this My Sense Tuesday.